Ash, we provided an update of the DREAMM-6 Phase I clinical trial, which is demonstrating the activity of Belantamab mefodotin, also known as Belamaf, in combination with Bortezomib and Dexamethasone. And this is an ongoing clinical trial, so is a current update of this. So essentially, this is a study for patients with relapsed and refractory myeloma who had at least one or more prior lines of treatment. And of note, they were allowed to have previous Bortezomib exposure. DREAMM-6 is an ongoing study with two parts to it. Part A is involving Belantamab mefodotin in combination with lenalidomide and dexamethasone. And what we've reported at ASH is Arm B, which is the combination with Bortezomib and dexamethasone. And in the clinical trial, we were looking at different schedules and dosing of Belamaf, but the most mature data is with Belamaf 2.5 milligrams per kilogram, which is given on a single dose every cycle, which is every 21 days, in combination with Bortezomib, which is given in the standard fashion. That's days 1, 4, 8, and 11 of a 21-day cycle with dexamethasone. And that's the most mature data, which is what we're reporting at this year's ASH. We're looking predominantly at the safety and tolerability of this regimen, but also trying to understand some of the clinical activity for this. So what was interesting is that we reported the results for 18 patients. This was a fairly heavily pretreated population who'd had between 1 and 11 prior lines of therapy, the median being 3. There was 28% of patients had extramedullary disease, and a significant proportion of patients had prior daratumumab, and the vast majority, that's about 90%, had prior Bortezomib exposure. We're not aware at the moment of the proportion of patients who had refractoriness to Bortezomib. What we saw was that this treatment was well tolerated. There was no dose-limiting toxicities, and so the study proceeded into the expansion phase. We're reporting the results of 18 patients, so that includes the dose escalation and the dose expansion phase combined. In terms of side effects, well, the most common one was that of keratopathy. We're aware that Belantamab mefodotin affects the corneas, and all patients had either grade 2 or grade 3 keratopathy. We also saw thrombocytopenia, and again, this wasn't unexpected, as this is an overlapping toxicity of both Belantamab and Bortezomib. And again, we saw grade 2, grade 3, and indeed some grade 4 events for thrombocytopenia. And then we saw a small number of grade 2 infusion-related reactions. And just to point out again that pre-medications are not mandated with this agent. And so a small proportion of patients did have very mild infusion-related reactions, which were confined to the first dose, and we didn't really see that thereafter. In terms of the tolerability, well, no patients discontinued Belamaf due to toxicities. We did see a small number of patients discontinuing Bortezomib due to that. And there were a number of dose interruptions required because of keratopathy and also because of thrombocytopenia. But overall, patients managed to continue on treatment for significant amounts of time. The durability of the response is not yet determined because of the short follow-up, but we do have the overall response rate to present at this year's meeting. So the overall response rate was 78%. And what was really interesting about that 78% was that a significant proportion of those patients achieved a VGPR, 61% or 11 patients, and 1 patient achieving a stringent CR. We also saw very high response rates irrespective of Bortezomib exposure, and the response rate was slightly lower at 67% for those patients who had prior daratumumab exposure. The clinical benefit rate was 83%, and that takes into consideration those patients achieving a minor response as well. We also looked at the response rates depending on the previous lines of treatment. The 4 patients who'd had 1 prior line of therapy all achieved a VGPR or greater, and then those patients with 2 or more lines of therapy achieved PRs as well. So what you could see was that the response rate was much higher, 100% for those at 1 prior line, and then drops down for those patients who'd had more than 1 prior line of treatment. So in summary, this is preliminary interim data from the DREAMM-6 clinical trial, which I think demonstrates that Belantamab mefodotin in combination with Bortezomib and Dexamethasone is safe. It appears to be well tolerated. There were no new safety signals that we saw. And I think that the response rate of 78% was very encouraging and certainly makes it appealing to move forward into phase 3 clinical trials, which is what you're going to start to see opening up in the near future.